Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. She wasn't supposed to be a bride. She wasn't even supposed to be a woman yet. The year was 1911, deep in the rolling backwoods of Appalachia, where the mountains cast long shadows, and the law was as thin as the winter air. They said Clara Whitford was spoken for, promised before she even had her first birthday. By the time she was 9, her fate had already been sealed, not to a stranger, but to a cousin more than twice her age. And in that valley, this was not seen as a scandal. It was seen as tradition. The photographs that remain are few, but they are haunting. A girl with the hollow cheeks of malnutrition, a ribbon in her hair that had been passed down from sister to sister, cousin to cousin. The dress she wore was not white, but an old yellowing thing pulled from a trunk in the attic. And beside her, a man whose face was lined not just by age, but by a kind of hunger, an ancient, unbroken hunger that had been fed the same way for generations. Inbreeding in these hills was not whispered about. It was woven into the bloodlines. Families doubled back on themselves so many times that the family tree had stopped branching. And in Clara's case, her own parents were already dangerously close in relation. Some say this wedding was not just the union of two people, but the continuation of a closed loop, a loop that had already produced children who could not walk straight, who could not speak without a slur, who were doomed to live and die within a few miles of where they were born. The town's preacher said it was God's will. The family said it was keeping the blood pure. Outsiders rarely came up the dirt road that led to her father's cabin. But when they did, they knew better than to ask questions. In these parts, questions could disappear you. And so Clara became a wife before she could even read. She cooked for him. She washed his clothes in the cold creek. And she learned far too soon that the bedroom door was not a place she could refuse to enter. This was her life until the day something happened that would set the whole hollow whispering. Clara's world was no bigger than the hollow she was born into. The mountains closed her in like walls, and the people inside them seemed bound by the same unwritten code, one that put family above all else, even when family meant something twisted. Her husband, Elijah Whitford, was not only her cousin, but a man who had grown up under the same roof as her mother for a time. In truth, his claim to her began long before she could understand what it meant. Elijah was 32 when Clara was married to him. To him, she was an inheritance, not a partner. His family had spent decades trading daughters between cousins to keep land and names from drifting into the hands of outsiders. Every few years, the Whitfords would host a gathering, not unlike a wedding fair, where young girls were paired off with men already chosen for them. It was during one of these gatherings, when Clara was barely walking, that her future was decided with a handshake between men whose blood already ran too close. The Whitford bloodline was notorious, even among neighboring hollows. Their eyes, people said, held a far-off look, and some of their children bore strange defects, fingers that fused together, jaws that grew crooked, minds that never seemed to fully wake. But instead of being shamed, these traits became almost a badge of belonging. To be pure Whitford was to carry the proof of it in your bones. Clara didn't know any of this when she was small. All she knew was that Elijah's presence was constant. He would bring her small trinkets carved from wood, teach her how to carry water from the spring, and correct her if she forgot to call him sir. By the time she was 8, he had already moved into her family's cabin, claiming it was so he could look after her. By the time she was 9, the preacher was called, and a Bible was placed in her trembling hands. There was no courtship, no escape, and certainly no consent. The women in her family told her it was her duty. They said it with tight smiles and voices that trembled only when the men weren't in earshot. And though Clara did not yet have the words for it, a cold dread began to grow in her that would never leave her, not even decades later. It was this dread that made her notice something others ignored. There were things about Elijah's past that were never spoken of. Whispers about his first wife, whispers about what had happened to her. And the deeper Clara looked, the more she realized this marriage had been written in blood long before she was born. Clara first heard about Elijah's first wife on a winter evening when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire in the hearth had burned down to a dim reddish glow. Her grandmother was mending a quilt, her fingers moving quick through faded cloth when she said it without looking up. "You're his second." The words were almost swallowed by the creak of the rocking chair, but Clara caught them. Second? No one had told her there was a first. When she asked who the first was, the old woman's eyes flicked toward the door and then back to her needle. "Best you don't ask." That was the last she said on the matter. But Clara was young, and in the silence of those mountain nights, a question like that doesn't fade, it grows. Over the next months, she pieced together fragments. The first wife had been a Whitford, too. Elijah's cousin on the other side of the ridge. Some said she had been sickly. Others claimed she was made that way. And then, one autumn, she was gone. No one spoke of a funeral. No one marked her grave. People who lived closest to Elijah's homestead whispered she had run into the woods and never returned. Others, in voices lowered to almost nothing, suggested she hadn't left at all, that she was buried somewhere behind the barn, in soil so churned by roots and stones that nothing would grow there. The strangest part was how Elijah carried himself after she was gone. He never wore mourning clothes. He never spoke her name. It was as though she had never existed, and yet he was quick to claim Clara soon after, too quick, perhaps, as if the loss of one bride was simply an inconvenience to be remedied. In the Whitford Hollow, no one challenged Elijah. He was quiet, but there was something in his silence that kept people from crossing him. Some believed the land itself belonged to him, that he could decide who stayed and who left. The fact that he chose Clara, barely 9 years old, was never questioned aloud. But to Clara, it began to feel like a sentence handed down before she could even defend herself. In the stillness of their cabin, Elijah sometimes stared at her in a way that made her skin crawl, measuring, appraising, as though she were livestock he had bought too soon, but would still fatten for slaughter. And in those moments, she began to fear that whatever had happened to his first wife might one day happen to her. The spring after her wedding, Clara began to see the hollow with new eyes. She noticed things she hadn't before, things the grown-ups either didn't see or pretended not to. Elijah's homestead sat apart from the others, its barn leaning under the weight of years, the boards weathered to a dull gray. Behind it, the ground sloped toward a patch of earth where the grass grew thinner, weaker, like it was struggling against something buried beneath. Clara had heard the stories about that patch of earth, but she didn't need stories to know there was truth in them. Elijah kept her close, rarely letting her go farther than the edge of the property. When she did wander, she would find other Whitford women, faces drawn and tired, hanging laundry or carrying buckets from the creek. They would glance at her, but they never smiled. There was a heaviness in their eyes, a kind of knowledge that made them look older than they were. Clara started to understand they were all trapped in the same way, born, and after that, Clara Whitford was never seen again. She vanished into that cold night, surrounded by her own blood. No one asked any questions. No one came looking. The earth of Whitford Hollow swallowed another one of its secrets, just as it had done many times before.